Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Before introducing this week's guest, I want to announce our upcoming book club, reading The Theory of Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith. Dan Klein and I are going to do a series of podcasts on the book, and you can read along and listen and share your reactions, comments, and questions. The first episode of the book club will be our regular Monday release next week, April 6th. Dan and I will discuss the significance and key insights of the book using some key passages as an introduction. After that, we'll read through the book, and subsequent podcasts will be released midweek as a bonus, in addition to our regular schedule. If you're interested, listen in, whether you're reading along or not. We've created a page for the book club, www.econtalk.org/bookclub.html. And you can also get there by going to the EconTalk homepage, and up in the left-hand corner, you'll see a link to the EconTalk book club page. On the book club page, you'll find a link to the entire book that you can read online at no charge. It's part of the Library of Economics and Liberty, the website that EconTalk is part of. You'll also find additional readings and links to our podcasts as we post them. If you want to get a head start on your reading, our second podcast on the book will be on part 1 and will be released around April 15th. Each podcast will have its own page where you can comment and react as it's released. These comments will serve as a discussion board that Dan and I will drop into from time to respond to your reactions. It's a work in progress. I'm not sure the exact schedule yet of readings down the road, but we'll try to keep you posted at that book club page and in the podcasts themselves. I'm sure I'll learn a lot from reading The Theory of Moral Sentiments with Dan Klein as my guide, and hope you will too. Now on to this week's guest. It's March 11th, 2009, and my guest today is Brink Lindsey of the Cato Institute and the author of The Age of Abundance, How Prosperity Transformed America's Politics and Culture. Brink, welcome to EconTalk.
Russ, glad to be here.
Your book, The Age of Abundance, is a sweeping cultural, economic, and political history of the 20th century. I want to talk first about the economic part of it, the prosperity part. Despite the Great Depression and 2 world wars, the 20th century was an incredible success in terms of material well-being for America. And I'd like you to summarize a little bit of that success because I think it's often underappreciated and not well understood.
Yes, over the course of the 20th century, per capita income multiplied something like 4 times. Life expectancy was, I can't remember exactly, but around 40 years, low 40s in 1900. It was up well into the 70s by the end of the century. Much of that had to do with precipitous declines in childhood mortality with the conquest of various epidemic diseases. Enormous increases in standard of living, the suburbanization of America so that single-family homes became the norm for many people. Of course, one technological marvel after another that transformed our lives, automobiles and TVs being prominent amongst them. And of course, the whole thing really got rolling in the latter decades of the 19th century with what we call our Industrial Revolution, what economic historians sometimes call the Second Industrial Revolution. But the advent of mass production and mass distribution, which really got rolling in the 1870s, 1880s, and which was then just precipitated a chain reaction of economic dynamism that then in turn led to cultural dynamism. My book focuses on the post-World War II period, and I would argue that it was in the post-war boom in the 1950s that America represented something fundamentally new under the sun. Of course, it had been building incrementally all along, but by the 50s, you could say that this was a country where the vast majority of people were well insulated from the edge of subsistence where most human beings had lived for all of history. So most people lived with a fair degree of material comfort. In fact, an extravagant degree of material comfort by historical standards, and only a minority of people were considered in poverty. This is something that is without precedent. It was also a situation where not only were they insulated from want, but they were insulated from nature. America had always been a prosperous country by world standards, but it was one where most people still made their living as farmers, directly exposed to the vagaries of nature for their well-being. Whereas by the 1950s, most people lived in cities, began working in offices, lived in basically a human-created world, a world of human institutions and human inventions, and didn't directly face nature except for recreation. Again, a fundamental change in the human condition.
Yeah, I think the book, while it focuses on the last half of the 20th century, I think it's longer perspective. You do a really superb job in chronicling the changes in material access to material stuff for the average person. And we've talked on this show before about how little understood that transformation is. So yes. I don't want to understate it, the importance of that. But I do think, and I recommend people to read the opening part of the book. Just for that alone, it's worthwhile to read the scope and breadth of what has changed in our lives for the average person in the last 100 years. But as you point out, you're more interested, I think, in most of the book, in the cultural consequences of that prosperity, which is interesting in and of itself, because I think most people treat culture as sort of it's an emergent Hayekian phenomenon, surely. But most, I think, folks don't think much about where it comes from or what forces work on it. And I think one of your contributions is to focus on that aspect of prosperity.
Yeah, I spend a good time setting up the immensity of this economic transformation because I want people to get it. You're right. We all take it for granted. It's like fish in the water. That's how we treat material abundance. We just it's all around us. And so we just treat it as natural. It's fundamentally not natural at all. It's incredibly unnatural. It's incredibly artificial. It's incredibly novel. And once you get that in your head, once you sort of have your historical imagination awakened to the point where you can see that we live in a situation that is just dramatically, radically different from the way most human beings have lived for the 100,000 years plus of human existence, and for the 10,000 years of civilized existence.
But
then you think, that, well, of course there must be fundamental and important cultural changes that go along with this. You can't change your entire way of life in this dramatically radical way and not have your way of life and your beliefs and your values and your attitudes change as well.
But one counterpoint, and I think you allude to it in passing, but reject its importance. One counterpoint is the economist's argument that there's always scarcity. You never have enough of anything, and I think Thomas Sowell pointed this out very well, that when you look at the newspaper, they're always bemoaning the fact that people don't have enough of what they want. There's always stress and hardship, no matter how high the average rises. But your claim is that is missing the bigger picture.
Yeah, I think, of course, in the economic perspective, scarcity is ineradicable. People always want more. There's always trade-offs at the margins. So in that sense, there's always scarcity. But in a sociological sense, what I refer to as scarcity is being close to that margin of subsistence and having it stare you in the face, whereas that's just not the case anymore. Right now, we're talking about and understandably so. It's a severe contraction, and yet our economy has shrank 2% last year,
right.
and so that means we're still just as rich as we were the year before, right? And which means that we're amongst the very richest people in all of history, and the trade-offs we're facing of cutting back on a vacation or not buying a new car this year or not putting an addition on the house, these are just completely different from going without food.
Yeah, I'm still one of the few Americans with a 27-inch television, and life is, it's tough. But I think you're right. We need to, we need to put it in perspective. And I don't have cable, but that's for really non-material reasons. That's to protect my children and myself from watching sports 27 hours a day.
Understood.
But I think it cannot be understated. Obviously, people adjust their expectations to what they're used to. But this type of the current situation, the stress and hardship of the current situation is trivial compared to 1933. We hope it won't get anything close to that, but at the current level, they shouldn't be compared.
No, and the reason we're so successful and so rich and so productive is that we immediately equilibrate to the new situation and then want more, right? We want things to be even better, and we take for granted where we are, and we want things to be better. And that attitude is, I think, fantastic. If we were as satisfied with our lot as you might want us to be, then people wouldn't be quite as agitating to keep inventing better mousetraps and keep going. So
extending that lifespan.
But the downside of that sort of insatiability is that people don't fully appreciate how good they've got it.
So let's turn to the cultural issues. You argue that prosperity in the post-war era, the 50s and then coming into the 60s and 70s, created two large cultural movements on both the left and the right. So talk about what those are and how they respond by that prosperity.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, and of course, I think what I do in the book is demonstrate how economic changes produce cultural changes. I don't think the causation runs only in that direction. I think causation runs every which way. But it's important to see how economic changes do produce cultural changes, and cultural changes in turn produce economic changes. And I talk a little bit about that in the book as well. But the main change here is, and to boil it down to one thesis, is that I think that this abundance, material prosperity, the end of scarcity in the sense I use it, pushes us towards cultural individualism. When people are poor, they don't have a lot of choices. They don't have a lot of stuff. They don't have a lot of choice about what to consume. They don't have a lot of choice about where to live. So things are very simple. You do this or you die. Likewise, everybody's kind of alike. When people are poor, that means the division of labor is very underdeveloped. Most 90% of people are subsistence farmers, and so there isn't a lot of variety in human experience. And then finally, everything's the same from generation to generation. Without economic growth and poverty, one generation is like the next. If your dad was a farmer, you'll be a farmer. If your dad was a cobbler, maybe you'll be a cobbler too. But not a lot of change. So in this world of sort of uniformity and changelessness and lack of choice, it makes sense that the kinds of cultural values that held sway were one-size-fits-all values, that people belong to this group, that they owe loyalty to this group, that they do what this group says or else, because when there's no margin for error, you can't have a lot of freelancing. And so that's our traditional moralities that evolved over the civilized era, during the agrarian era, tended to be sort of absolutist and did not give great scope for individuals to go their own way, simply because the material conditions for them to go their own way weren't there. But when those material conditions changed, I think you see the inevitability, virtually, of culture opening up to accommodate that change and to accommodate these wider choices. That when you've got all these wider choices, and when people have all kinds of different experiences and different jobs and different interests that they can pursue, and then they get different values and attitudes and priorities. The old traditional moralities that says everybody should follow a certain set prescribed course of action just feel increasingly confining. And what we saw sort of burbling under the surface in the 50s and then exploding in the 60s was a full-scale rebellion against the confinement of old ways of doing things and asserting sort of the self and the desires of the self to do your own thing in the expression of the 60s. So we saw in race relations the spontaneous uprising of African Americans in the civil rights movement, taking direct action to try to put it into, and in rapid order succeeding in putting it into this oppressive system of Jim Crow.
Right, that alone would have been an extraordinary cultural change to happen over such a short period. But of course, it wasn't the only one.
No, no, and then you have, of course, the feminist revolution of the 60s and 70s, and the dramatic expansion of the number of jobs that were open to women, and a complete overhaul of the whole idea of the traditional sexual division of labor and the proper relations between men and women. You had a new consciousness of the importance of the natural environment and a more interest in quality of life. How those interests were then put into practice in public policy is another question, but the values, I think, are obviously related to affluence. You had a rise in hedonism, just an increase in interest in physical fitness, also, of course, sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Yep.
And all of these things, I think, have a common denominator of pushing against traditional limits and pushing for the sort of self-assertion. I talk a lot in the book about the psychologist Abraham Maslow, who famously described the hierarchy of human psychological needs, which he depicted as a kind of pyramid, or rather in Psycho 101 textbooks, it's depicted as a pyramid. At the broad base are the sort of existential needs of food and shelter, just survival needs. When those needs are in doubt, you just can't think about anything else. Nothing else matters. If your belly's empty or if you're being chased by a predator, you don't care about anything else. If, however, you can take survival and basic security for granted, then you don't stop worrying. You start worrying about new things. You start worrying about, do I have friends? Am I loved? Am I a valuable member of my community? What Maslow calls belonging and esteem needs. And if you're lucky enough to have all those in the bank, again, you don't stop worrying. You start worrying about yet another set of new things. Namely, am I realizing my potential? Am I being all I can be? Am I living in tune with the real me, whatever that might be? These are what Maslow calls self-actualization needs. So he's talking about individual psychology, but I think it applies very nicely to the social psychology or culture of post-war America. That coming into the 50s, we had survival and security now taken for granted. We had triumphed over. We had won our survival, so to speak, in World War II, and we had triumphed over economic insecurity through coming out of the Great Depression, and we brought in a new generation, the baby boomers, to be the first generation in all of human history to grow up taking their basic material needs for granted, and so we see them climbing Maslow's pyramid and start really pursuing self-actualization and self-realization in a more committed and sort of wide-ranging and adventurous way than ever before. I don't think it's any coincidence that 1964, the year the first baby boomers turned 18, was also the year of the first riots at Berkeley and the beginnings of what we call the 60s.
And yet, that set of cultural forces, which you've mentioned so far, which would generally be identified with the left,
yes,
were not the only forces going on. There were also a set of counter forces. So talk about those.
Yeah, well, the thing is, and the great irony is, that the people who were on the vanguard and the forefront of all of these new exploring these new possibilities and new values made possible by mass affluence tended to be on the left, and therefore tended to be extremely hostile to the institutions of capitalism and middle-class bourgeois morality that had created the affluence that made their new adventurousness possible. And so they were sort of fundamentally at war with themselves, or rather, they were attacking the institutional foundations of what they were all about. And that, I think, helped to provoke a mirror image phenomenon. So you had this new left arising during the 60s. Less attention was paid to it at the time, but much more so in the 70s and 80s. But a new right emerged at the same time. And that was one where people were forthrightly defending capitalism and defending traditional middle-class morality, but they were defending those things as traditions that were part of a larger set of traditions, all of which they were attached to, and so here you have the mirror image problem: people staunchly defending capitalism, and yet because they are generally traditionalists, people who are at least unsettled by, and at worst utterly hostile to, all the cultural dynamism that's being unleashed by capitalism. So on the one hand, you've got people condemning capitalism yet gobbling up its fruits. That's the people on the left. And then you've got people defending capitalism yet proclaiming its fruits are toxic, and that's the people on the right. Both sides have at their core, I think, a kind of, or came, both the new left and the new right had at their core what I think have to be described as spiritual movements. Obviously, in the case of the right, the emergence of the religious right, the utterly unexpected and yet incredibly influential emergence of theologically and socially conservative evangelical Protestantism. And then on the left, a kind of spiritual movement that was the counterculture, and both of those kind of spiritual convulsions during the 60s. One, everyone was paying attention to the hippies. No one was paying attention to the evangelicals during the 60s. But they proceeded in parallel, and they gave impetus to these larger political movements of left and right as we have known them until the present day. One side wedded to economic dynamism, but hostile to cultural dynamism. The left, vice versa.
And some would argue, you also mentioned that it's exaggerated, but some would argue that the so-called red state, blue state divide is one way of describing that tension.
No, that's the most recent way of thinking about these things, and so you tend to that, and yes, that's the continuation, I think, of ideological categories and ways of thinking about things that I think really grew out of the experience of the 60s, and so you have and of course, not everybody in the red states are conservative, and not everybody in the blue states are liberal, but
not even close.
But still, that you can talk about red Americans and blue Americans wherever they may be located. They tend to be geographically concentrated. But the red Americans tend to fight the fact that the 60s happened, and that irreversible changes that took place then they wish were reversible, and they tend to be sympathetic to accounts of moral and cultural decline. Meanwhile, on the left, you have people who are averse to the great economic dynamism that's occurred since the 60s, and that we can summarize by the sort of Reagan revolution of the 80s. They wish the 80s had never happened, and that the hopefully irreversible, they're trying to reverse them now, the hopefully irreversible changes of that era could be reversed. And they tend to think in terms of economic decline. So even during this long boom, which has sadly come to an end, they were always complaining about how it really wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and in particular focusing on things like inequality and seizing upon happiness literature to say that we're not really happy even though we're rich here. So always looking at the downside of economic dynamism.
Yeah, it's a half empty, half full story, and it's just a different, I guess, different half of the glass.
Right.
Is where the empty or the full part is.
Yep.
We're going to come back and talk about that in the last part of this conversation, but I want to ask you a question about cultural and economic freedom that I don't think you talked about in the book. There is a tendency among those of us who are big fans of economic dynamism, which I am and I know you are. We have a half empty, half full problem as well. We tend to talk about how well the economy has been doing.
Yes.
But at the same time, we bemoan the incursions of government, the size of government overall. You know, even though the cultural left is critical of economic change and has nostalgia for the past, we often argue that we really haven't embraced in the 80s, 90s, or now the free market ideals, and
Yes.
that it's just rhetorical that people paint the current era as some sort of laissez-faire free market era.
Right.
When I interviewed Milton Friedman for EconTalk, he talked with despair of how few of his ideas had actually been implemented. I was thrilled that any of them had been, and that many of them were on the table, whereas in the 60s they were totally taboo. At least we'd made some progress, but his attitude was, well, it's really very little progress given the current size of government, the size of taxation, and the regulatory structure, even though there's been some deregulation. Having said that, though, let me take the half-full view of economic progress and freedom and get your reaction, which is that maybe in parallel to the personal freedom you talked about, and that would be relative to identity, sex roles, sexuality, music, etc., you could argue that there is a great deal more economic freedom today than there was in 1950. True, we still have lots of regulations in the workplace. We've added a bunch of different kinds, environmental, discrimination, et cetera. And yet, the opportunity to be an entrepreneur, to be self-employed, has probably never been greater in any time than in any other time of human history. And I guess that's my half-full part of that story. Do you think I'm right?
Yeah, I do. I would answer that in a couple of parts. First, I'm in favor of economic freedom because I'm in favor of freedom, and so and in that larger picture, I think our era stacks up very nicely compared to any era in American history or human history. I think libertarians are vulnerable to kind of golden age thinking that the world was darn near perfect at the signing of the Constitution, and it's been all downhill ever since.
Thomas Jefferson was the ideal, and after that, it's just a bunch of politicians.
Right, and yet Thomas Jefferson owned human beings and raped them.
Correct. Yeah.
And so
he wasn't a small government president.
And so it's so there were millions of people who were in the most complete privation of freedom there is in chattel slavery. Women had no legal identity after marriage, couldn't sign contracts, own land, were fundamentally subjects of their husbands, couldn't complain against their husbands for rape until the 60s or 70s. Just a few decades ago. Immigrants, when they came here, faced ferocious hostility and prejudice and oppression. So censorship was endemic in American life, just government censorship, and again, a kind of cultural intolerance of small town life was felt very oppressive to a whole bunch of people who didn't fit side and on the cultural side, there is just much greater latitude today for the whole range of Americans to live their lives as they see fit than before. On the economic policy side, or just on the economic side, first on the policy side, compared to the 19th century, we're incredibly heavily regulated. But compared to the immediate post-war decades, I think our economy is much freer to entrepreneurship and competition than it was before. We had wholesale suppression of market competition in industry after industry with price and entry controls, and we had indirect suppression of entrepreneurship through incredibly high progressive tax rates. And so we had very high trade barriers, and not to mention not much effective competition from the rest of the world anyway, because it was a smoking ruin after World War II.
And it was far away.
Yes,
which
and that's right.
Technology has changed that.
So on the policy front, I think there has been, and I talk about this some in the book, there has been this wholesale economic deregulation that occurred in the 70s and 80s, and that most of which isn't being touched. Nobody wants to go back to the AT&T monopoly or the old regulated airfares or oil and gas price controls, or all the other trucking regulation. All of these things that were the way things were back in the old days, back in the 50s and 60s. So I think our economy is more, the policies are more conducive to competition and entrepreneurship than they were a generation ago, by far. Government is bigger than ever, and part of that, I'm afraid, is a kind of perverse testament to our success in getting the economic policies right. That by unshackling our economy from all of this kind of cartelistic economic regulation, we've allowed our economy to become so productive that we have been able to afford a big deadweight loss of wasteful government and still keep chugging along. When in the 70s we weren't chugging along anymore. The whole system was breaking down in the pain of stagflation, and that precipitated this wave of economic deregulation. And yet since then we've had this huge boom, and so it's one of the reasons we've had government grow so big is because it hasn't felt like it's felt like we could afford it. Of course, we might have done better, even better, without this deadweight burden. But the fact is, things were getting better and better even with it, and that's a testament to the productive power of the relatively liberalized marketplace.
Yeah, and investors and entrepreneurs and managers find ways around some of that. They find ways to minimize the price of it, the cost of it, whether it's environmental regulation or labor force regulation. We're such a dynamic economy, and as you point out many times in the book, the division of labor that's been unleashed by our prosperity then reinforces it and feeds on it. So you can have a whole industry coping with regulation. Any new,
yes.
The whole Sarbanes-Oxley, which is, I think, a disastrous mistake. Well, it's not as costly as it would normally be because it quickly creates an industry. It's a wasteful industry,
yes.
But it's an industry that complies with the regulation
right.
at a minimal cost.
Right.
It's amazing.
So, people talk about the difference between negative liberty and positive liberty, and this goes to, I think, the point you were making in your question. Negative liberty is freedom from, in particular, freedom from government, and positive liberty is freedom to, and particularly just freedom, the effective power to do what you want. And libertarians focus rightly on negative liberty, negative freedom. That's the focus of their concern. But why do we care about that? We care about it because one of the major reasons we care about it is because negative liberty is so conducive to positive liberty that we think that limited government and free markets produces prosperity and human flourishing, and we're right. And so that's the ultimate ball game, is how much positive liberty we have. And today, I think it's virtually inarguable that people have more choices, more options, more alternatives than they ever have, ever. And so in that bottom line sense, we're freer than ever before.
And I think it's important to mention, as you do many times, and you've alluded to here, it's not just about different kinds of dental floss, which we do have. We have unbelievable choice in dental floss. It's amazing that there's more than 5 kinds. You can get mint, you can get waxed, you can get Gore-Tex, you can get flavored of different other kinds, short, long, fat, thin, and you can have any record, any song.
Yes.
It's an amazing access to some wonderful things. But our choices, I think the choices we often forget about are those cultural and identity choices for people who are exploring life and who they are. And I think that's just such an important aspect of prosperity and freedom.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I talk about in the book is coming out of the 60s and 70s and then coming out of the economics or renaissance of the 80s, this wild proliferation of subcultures and new cultural identities, and certainly the internet and greater communication has facilitated that. But once upon a time, like when we were kids, there was maybe 1 or 2 ways to be cool when you were in high school. There was one in group. Now there's just this wild profusion of different little affinity groups, and there's a whole bunch of different ways to fit in. If you had oddball, non-mainstream tastes when you were a kid growing up in 50s small-town America, you're just out of luck, right? There's nobody to share it with. You feel like a loner. You feel like a weirdo. You feel isolated. These days, you can hook up through the internet and find fellow enthusiasts for whatever strange thing that anybody could possibly be into, and so you feel connected to other people, and you feel like your interests are validated and real and important, and you can achieve self-realization because the opportunities are there to have a custom-made life, one that fits exactly the dimensions of your needs, priorities, and values.
So you're not sympathetic to this argument that the internet is a bunch of strange people bowling alone, surfing alone, sitting in their cubicle, unconnected to human beings, and living a virtual digital life that's a pale imitation of the real thing.
Yeah, I don't buy that. I mean, I think a couple of things. I can't remember who made up the 90% rule, but basically the rule is 90% of everything is crap. And so, we have this amazing proliferation of stuff these days and options, and a lot of it's vulgar and base and stupid and trivial and shallow and okay.
And seductive.
And
sometimes.
And in moderation, doing vulgar, shallow, superficial things is fine. It's fun. It's great to have a couple of glasses of wine with dinner. It's terrible to be a wino. It's great to be able to watch things, on television and to see world events live and to see great or entertaining programs. It's terrible to be a couch potato. So you have all of these options, and there's all kinds of ways to exercise them poorly. And so we just have more of everything now. We have more trash, and we have more superlative greatness than ever before. So the opportunities to live, a phenomenally well-lived life have never been more within our grasp. Whether everybody, uses their freedom wisely is a different matter. But that's a fundamental faith that libertarians have is that if you give people freedom, they're going to do okay. That the very predictable ways in which people will misuse their freedom are more than compensated for by the unpredictable miracles that occur when people are free to do their own thing and be creative.
Yeah, I'd put it differently. I'd much prefer a world where people abuse the internet, television, and alcohol than a world where centralized power keeps them from doing X, Y, or Z, whatever it happens to be.
No, I'll take the mix of the messy mix of freedom to the kind of stale conformity of top-down control any day of the week.
Yeah. For me, it's the ultimate test of adulthood is learning to deal with that in moderation. I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. They'd rather see the government keep things from their kids, and I'd rather see parents do it.
And that's something I talk about in the book, that I think we did go down a learning curve culturally after the 60s. We had all these traditional rules breaking down and all these new choices opening up. And at first, social conservatives had what looked like a very good case that the world was just going to hell, that this new cultural freedom was just too much, and people were misusing it so badly that it was just a disaster. So we had crime rates soaring, divorce rates soaring, welfare dependency soaring, single parenthood soaring, abortions soaring. All of these sort of indicators of social breakdown were just going through the roof from the mid-60s, certainly through the 70s, and many of these indicators through the 80s. But then, starting in the 1990s, we saw just about every one of these things start going in the other direction, and for reasons people really can't. For most of these things, people don't have a very good idea of here's the one thing that happened that changed everything. But I think what we saw was people learning how to deal with their freedom, and so new kinds of moral sensibilities and rules started kicking in that were more tolerant, less dogmatic, less absolutist, less grounded in sort of traditional belief structures than before. But they kicked in because people could tell that they worked and they were needed. That to have effective freedom, you have to be able to make commitments. That's one of the great exercises of freedom, is to commit yourself, which means then living within limits, but living within chosen limits. And so we started seeing that some of those chosen limits, like a work ethic and like being committed to your family, were indeed not part of the oppressive system, like the kind of countercultural radicals of the 60s said, but were indeed constituent elements of a well-lived life. And so we saw them kind of coming back into vogue. And as a result, I think what we're living in culturally now is a world where we're much freer than we were before, but we're getting increasingly better at living with that freedom and avoiding the mistakes and pitfalls that freedom brings with it.
When you argue, just to finish up this section of our conversation, when you argue that the world's becoming more libertarian, how much of that do you feel is the social types of libertarian freedom versus other, say, economic freedom?
Yeah, much more so. It's much more that. I think as your Mason colleague Brian Kaplan has depressingly documented, most Americans are economically illiterate. They don't understand fundamental concepts of economics, and so therefore they are prone to economic demagoguery. Also, everybody likes free ice cream, and so if you promise people free stuff and there's a disconnect between the government spending and the taxation that ultimately has to pay for it, then people will go for it. And so that kind of big government in terms of spending is frequently popular, and we're seeing some of that right now. So I think there's just, it would just be foolish to try to assert that most Americans are any kind of rigorous libertarians. I think Americans, relative to most people in the world, and relative to Europeans in particular, do have a big fat libertarian streak. They do believe more than Europeans by a fair sight that individuals ought to be responsible for making their own way in life, and that if they failed, then they probably did something wrong. Sometimes that belief is unfair, but it's a very productive and useful belief to have, and Americans have it quite strongly. And going along with that, Americans have all along had a greater aversion to high taxes and to bossy government than similarly affluent people in other nations. So we do have that kind of libertarian streak. But on the cultural side, it's just clear that when it comes to race, the role of women in society, the proper scope of cultural expression, the role of religion in public life, about kind of religion across the board, conceptions of what it means to be an American. That is a much more expansive idea of American cultural identity than the old WASP version that used to be kind of the exclusive version. In all of these ways, Americans have become much more socially liberal, which is to say, culturally libertarian.
And freer.
Yes.
Well, let's shift gears because I want to talk about an essay you wrote that is related to some of these topics called Nostalgia Anomics, and we'll put a link up to it on this podcast site. You wrote this essay in response to this nostalgia for the egalitarian 1950s. There's an argument out there, I associate it mostly with Paul Krugman, but others have articulated it, that, as you mentioned earlier, in the 80s, we got more selfish and we allowed people to exploit the system and to get rich at the expense of others. And the 50s, that was a different time. There was a different cultural ethos about how much money a person should be making. There were so-called different rules. I find it absurd, but the argument is that in the 1980s, Reagan killed the air traffic controller strike, and that was the end of unions,
right,
which is an absurd argument. But unions, because they've been declining since 1950. But the argument is that without unions, somehow the average worker doesn't have a voice and has been exploited. That's why the middle class is dying, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So what is your response to that?
Yeah, I can just to segue from Age of Abundance to Nostalgianomics. I conclude the book with the assessment that our politics today, our politics of the sort of post-60s left and post-60s right, is in a reactionary rut. And you can tell it's in a reactionary rut because both sides are pining for the past and both sides are kind of nostalgic for the 1950s. The only difference is the right wants to live there and go home there, and the left wants to work there. And so the right has this idyllic sort of attachment to Ozzie and Harriet, and the
parent families,
right, and
going to church every week,
and the left has this idyllic attachment to the old big business, big government, big labor triumvirate, and the kind of the very visible, strong hand of government controlling things, which went along with great prosperity at the time, no doubt about it, and with a situation in which incomes were converging. That is, everybody was getting richer and getting richer at a nice clip, but people at the bottom were getting richer faster than people at the top. Whereas after the pain and suffering of the 70s, when growth started kicking up again, the trends looked different. Then everybody continued to get richer, but people at the top were getting richer fastest of all, and some people at the bottom or in the middle were barely trudging along, and some people actually had downward mobility as well. But so we have definitely, the left is correct that there has been a change in economic and in income trends, that we've gone from an era of income convergence to one of income divergence. And as you know, economic egalitarians, that pains them. So I, in this paper, I look at, well, what's causing this divergence? And the traditional or the prevailing economists' explanations of these new trends have been about structural changes in the economy, especially the technological revolution, the information technology revolution, and what economists call skill-biased technological change. That all of these technological changes have added up to greater relative demand for highly skilled workers, which means that their pay gets boosted relative to less skilled workers because of this state of affairs. And that's, without a doubt, that's going on. What Krugman and others, and Krugman really hasn't done any scholarship on this. He's just popularizing scholarship done by others, and in particular Frank Levy and Peter Temin at MIT. He's saying, well, that just can't, that isn't all of it. I think he's right, it isn't all of it. And he said, you've got to look also at changes in economic policies and changes in social norms. And that certainly makes sense. We've had dramatic changes in political economy since the 60s, dramatic changes in cultural norms since the 60s. We've just been talking about these things. So it makes sense that maybe that had something to do with it. And what I do in this paper is examine that hypothesis, and I think there is considerable support for the fact that both changes in economic policy and changes in cultural values have contributed to this income divergence. Krugman, but I think first, Krugman is extremely selective about what the changes are, and he's completely wrong-headed about what the changes mean. He wants to make it into this very sort of simplistic, ideologically satisfying for somebody left of center morality tale in which we lived in a golden age of the 50s, and then these evil right-wingers came along and tricked everybody by appealing to their racism into gutting the old post-war economic system.
The social contract.
And that's right, ripping up the social contract and allowing this new horrible plutocratic world. Right. So that's just terrible history, just terrible. So he wants to point out that there were policies that he likes that inhibited income divergence, and notably a high minimum wage and heavy degree of unionization. But he doesn't want to point out the whole range of other kind of cartelizing policies that also restricted competition, and therefore I think made the demand for highly talented people less acute. If everybody's going to, not a single airline ever went out of business between 1938 and deregulation in 1978. So how intensely are people going to compete for the best managers if the stakes are so low? So if there's a disconnect between productivity and performance, the competitive pressures for getting the very best people are going to be a lot less intense. So the more competitive we get, the more important it is to have the very best people around. So I think competition for top talent has increased dramatically because of a general increase in competitive pressures. Meanwhile,
which leads to higher rewards for the most
for everybody,
people.
Right? Meanwhile, we've seen more competition among people at the bottom, and one large reason is immigration. And so Krugman doesn't want to note that one of the reasons that white males had it so good, low-skilled white males had it so good in the 50s and 60s, is because they didn't have to compete against white women, and they didn't have to compete against blacks, and in particular, they didn't have to compete against immigrants. That we had a pretty much complete shutdown of immigration from the mid-1920s to the mid-1960s, such that the percentage of foreign-born Americans slipped from about 13% in 1920 to about 5% in 1970. Then, with the changes in immigration law in 1965, we've seen a new wave of mass immigration, and foreign-born population has gone up to 12% of the population again. So that's a huge wave of low-skilled workers, mostly from Mexico and Central America, who contribute significantly to the inequality picture. Statistically, in human terms, global inequality is decreasing. These people are making a lot more money than they were where they lived, so they're a lot better off. They're much closer to the people at the top of the American social scale than they were before. Virtually everybody in America is better off too. There are some low-skilled workers that might have had their incomes depressed relative to what would have been the case with stricter immigration. But the main effect is this statistical artifact. There's a guy who has, and it's cited in the paper, who has looked at recalculating the inequality trends if you factored in these people, the immigrants, at the beginning of the process back in the 1970s at their native country wages. And then you see that inequality has actually fallen. But the stats look worse.
Well, an example of that is that if you haven't finished high school in America, you're doing a lot worse.
Yeah.
But, of course, those snapshots from census data are not looking at the same people over time.
Of course,
it doesn't
that's right.
literally mean that a person without a high school diploma is doing worse. It means that the group of people who don't have high school diplomas in 2006, say, aren't doing as well as the people in 1970 who didn't have high school diplomas.
That's right. If you look,
But the people in 2006 who don't have high school diplomas, a lot of them are coming from foreign countries where their level of education is not very high and the quality is not very high. And so, not surprisingly, they drag down the average.
Yes. So on the what I see is that what we had, the old system of political economy, was one in which competition was suppressed in a wide variety of ways, and the dismantling of that anti-competitive policy apparatus has made our economy much more productive, made us much richer, and indeed has increased demand for people at the very top. So this is a side effect of great economic progress. On as far as unionization falling, that likewise is a casualty of economic progress. That it isn't because labor law changed in any significant way. The firing of the PATCO workers was a trivial incident. What mattered was that unions, which are labor market cartels, could only thrive in a relatively uncompetitive environment where the inflated costs that they produced, both labor costs directly and then inflating costs of production through restrictive work rules, those costs could be passed along to consumers who couldn't do anything about it. But with the emergence of global competition and then with the increasing migration of American manufacturing out of the traditionally unionized Northeast and Midwest into the South and Southwest, you've seen a lot more competition, and unions simply couldn't. The unionized workforces just started losing workers. That the fundamental reason for deunionization is because unionized workplaces have shrunk in employment at about 2% a year, whereas ununionized workplaces have grown in employment at about 2% a year. So the only way to make up for that would be through phenomenal organization of new industries, organization of unions in new industries peaked in the 1950s, has been going down ever since. So unions have just been contracting because the economy is free enough for us to work around these cartels, and that's what's been happening. So I see the inequality on the economic policy side as a side effect of great progress in better policies that weren't foisted on us by conservatives, but that were actually recognized as good ideas across the political spectrum. All of the economic deregulation, much of it started under Jimmy Carter. Ted Kennedy was the author of airline and trucking deregulation, and cheering him on as an activist was Ralph Nader. The last three major rounds of global trade talks were concluded by Democratic presidents: the Kennedy round by LBJ, the Tokyo round by Jimmy Carter, the Uruguay round by Bill Clinton. And of course, we associate tax cutting with Republicans, and famously, Reagan did lower the top individual rate from 70 to 50, but then it went all the way down to 28, thanks to a bill sponsored by two Democrats, Bill Bradley in the Senate and Dick Gephardt in the House. So I see this economic deregulation as a fundamentally bipartisan movement. So I think Krugman gets his history all wrong. On the cultural side, the only cultural norm he wants to talk about is the fact that people used to feel sheepish about paying their top executives a lot of money. And yeah, that's true. But that's part of a much broader and much more fundamental shift towards this kind of cultural individualism I was talking about. Just as people are much more into self-expression in the cultural realm, they're into self-expression in the economic realm too, and they want to be all they can be. They want to test the market and get their highest rewards, and we've seen, I think, less sense of being an organization man and loyal to the company, and that has, I think, contributed, at least to some extent, to greater rewards for people at the top, because people at the top are more interested in maximizing the rewards they get in the marketplace.
And as I think you point out, it's generally often forgotten, it isn't just CEOs who make a big multiple of the average worker. It's athletes and entertainers, places where it's clear there isn't some kind of boardroom conspiracy to reward their friends. It's a part of economic life that's changed. Part of that, of course, is due to some policy changes, free agency being the most obvious example in the case of athletes, but much of it is due to technology. The opportunity for athletes and entertainers to sell their product across a much larger market has led to high rewards at the very top.
Yes, absolutely. So that's right. The free agency, you saw it, first in movies with the breakdown of the old studio system, and then you saw it in athletics, and then you saw it in not just for CEOs, but for all highly talented, high-skilled workers, that as the sort of equivalent of free agency with this new world of global competition and much more intensive domestic competition as well with the deregulated environment. You had people shifting around from one company to the other or one industry to another much more so than in the past because the need to have the very best people was more acute, and you had more of a bidding war for these folks, and so that has allowed by putting the most able people in the most important places, that bidding war has been phenomenally beneficial to all of us because it has made the overall economy more productive than it otherwise would have been.
Yeah, but we're almost out of time. But before we leave this topic, I do want to mention that for the least skilled, again, I think much of the alleged problems in material well-being that they've experienced is something of a statistical artifact, but part of it is real, and part of it is the fact that our education system stinks, especially for poor people and people in bad urban neighborhoods. And if we want to do something about this, rather than go back to the cultural norms of the 50s, we ought to liberate our school system.
I agree with that.
So in closing, we haven't talked at all about the current situation that we're in. So I want you to give me your thoughts very briefly, which is on the question of a lot of people are claiming that because of the crisis, free markets are dead, Adam Smith is dead, Milton Friedman is dead. What are your thoughts on the future of a more free market economic policy space and where we might be heading?
I'm hopeful. These are not times where it's easy to be hopeful if you believe in small government and free markets. But as I said, I believe that we've gotten into an ideological rut and a reactionary rut where both sides are just not tuned into the combination of economic and cultural dynamism that we have in this age of abundance. And I think that in recent years we saw the right run out of gas. That finally this movement kind of fell apart in its reactionary being out of touch with the center of American public opinion. That
got power also, which is not so good for it.
That's right. But what started out as a kind of a broad-based appeal to middle America, and that's how the right wing really got going in the late 60s, the silent majority, became, as they kept clinging to this sort of traditional way of looking at things, became more and more sectarian, more and more narrow, and more nasty about everybody else. And so finally, I think they lost touch with the center, and the center went to the Democratic Party because they didn't like being the idea that everybody who lived in not in red states or was not a real American. So I think that I feel that ideology of hostility to cultural dynamism really lost touch with the center of American public opinion and paid it a heavy price. I think the less hostility to economic dynamism is getting a big workout right now, and I think it's not going to work out well. And I'm hopeful that this big government instinct, anti-market instinct, anti-entrepreneur instinct, and anti-success instinct is going to discredit itself as well because it's going to lead to bad policies, and the bad policies are going to lead to bad results. But we're going to have to go through a fairly nasty learning process before we get to that point.
My guest today has been Brink Lindsey of the Cato Institute, author of The Age of Abundance. Brink, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Great pleasure.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more Econ Talk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for Econ Talk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.